Morning there, guys. I think, but I'm not entirely sure. I think there's only two or three of us on the call today. Um, so fingers crossed a few more will join, but if not, then it's always nice because it makes for slightly more kind of intimate session. I'm hoping, in actual fact, today's session won't be as long as previous ones have been, because we're going to try and deliberately keep it fairly high level today. And that's kind of a fairly conscious decision because neurodiversity is a fairly broad topic, and it can be pigeonholed just a little bit sometimes. And I don't think that's really a great approach to take as we're going to cover through the course of today. So we're going to keep it to some sort of more general principles as opposed to necessarily looking kind of more in depth at conditions and their impact and so on. Um, so for if either of you have not sort of sat on one of these before, or if we've not had anything to do with each other in the past, just by way of a brief introduction, my name's Harry. I'm the director here at Smart Clinic. We are an occupational health business, so primarily our speciality is in assessing fitness for work and health conditions and the impact any health conditions have on people's ability to work. And you'll see as we go along through the course of today that will kind of translate to some of the approaches that we take when when we're looking at neurodiversity and neurodiversity in the workplace in particular. Um, so just to give a very high level overview, what we're actually talking about here. Well, neurodiversity, as you probably know, is generally categorized into, or it's generally an umbrella term for seven neurodivergent conditions. Whether they are considered to be health conditions or not depends really on what approach you're taking. Um, as we are going to cover a little bit later on today, when it comes to the law, they are considered health conditions. When it comes to medicine, that's slightly more contentious. They're sort of partly social, partly medical, partly psychological conditions. Um, so the most common seven neurodivergent conditions are autism, by which we also include autistic spectrum disorder. You may, in years gone by, have known that under the name Asperger syndrome. Asperger is no longer considered to be a diagnosis. That would be termed as autistic spectrum disorder instead. The reason for that is because autism in its own right is generally seen as being on a spectrum, and with kind of autism as a condition being at one extreme of the spectrum, but you can kind of be sort of less autistic, if you want to put it that way, and just be considered to be on the autistic spectrum disorder rather than having a formal diagnosis of autism. And technically, we're all on the spectrum, so technically we all sit somewhere on there. It's just that some people will be sort of further up the spectrum than others, so to speak. Um, Dyslexia, that's probably one of the more commonly understood conditions, but there's also dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, as well as ADHD, which stands for attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and Tourette's syndrome, which again is a more commonly understood or observed one. But we're going to generally refer to neurodiversity in its entirety for the remainder of today, but it's just to point out when we're talking about that, these are the things that we are generally referring to. Now, I think the first thing to mention in this session is the prevalence of neurodiversity. The very fact that we're running a session on this and the very fact that you guys are attending a session on this generally demonstrates that there is an increasing need for awareness and understanding amongst employers. Um, there's some very interesting statistics on this. Just in the last 5 years alone, so since 2020, for example, there's been an increase in ADHD related tribunals of over 750%, which is an enormous increase in just 5 years. Um, there's also been a significant rise in ADHD diagnoses and autism diagnoses, full stop. And it's currently estimated that approximately 1 in 5 people will be considered to be neurodivergent in one way or another. There's all sorts of different stats and data in terms of the increase, but the NHS themselves say that in I think it was, I want to say 2018, they were receiving approximately 15,000 autism referrals per month. In 2023, so 5 years later, they're receiving 45,000. So that's increased 3 times in 5 years. So there is a big increase, and with greater prevalence, and this can be attributed to a number of things. Obviously, there may be biological and genetic explanations for this, but with a greater understanding of neurodivergence, there's also, amongst sort of the lay population, there's also a greater interest in it and a greater interest in receiving diagnoses for such things. With that also comes a greater access to both private and NHS services. Now, that's really the significant element of the increase has come from the private services rather than the NHS services. But what it has resulted in is generally a significantly increased rate of diagnosis being presented to employers, and with that, as we described earlier, also comes greater issues and subsequently greater tribunals. Greater as in number, not as in better. Now, an increase in prevalence, understanding, and diagnosis of neurodiversity isn't exclusively a good thing, nor is it exclusively a bad thing. It obviously has benefits to individuals to be able to sort of better understand their conditions and their thought patterns and their cognitive functioning. From an employer's point of view, it also represents greater opportunity to sort of celebrate their strengths and encourage them to be successful in their roles. That's something we'll also talk about. However, it also creates more of a burden, particularly on HR departments, who are expected to do something more about it than perhaps they might have done in the past. And that's where the likes of us come in. That's where the likes of occupational health organisations come in, is we try to help you sort of navigate some of these challenges a little bit. So I mentioned earlier there's sort of some debate over whether neurodiversity is considered to be a health condition because it's really to do with cognitive functioning, cognitive patterns and thought processes and information processing, rather than it is sort of traditional medical matters. That said, we also need to look at the legal definition. And under the Equality Act 2010, as you all well know in your jobs, there are a number of protected characteristics, and one of those is disability. So we need to look at whether neurodiversity is considered to be a disability under the Equality Act. So firstly, is it automatically covered by the Equality Act? No, it's not. You can never ever say that neurodiversity is automatically covered by the Equality Act. That, interestingly, is a matter where some of the neurodiversity companies, naming no names, are giving bad advice because they will say that it's automatically covered. It's not. There are only two things that you can say that are automatically covered by the Equality Act as a disability. One of them is cancer, the other one is multiple sclerosis. If it's not one of those, then ultimately it remains a legal decision as to whether somebody is covered by the Equality Act or not, or whether they're considered disabled under the Equality Act or not. So next we look at, well, is it likely to be covered by the Equality Act? And the answer is yes. In most instances, it is very, very likely that someone with a neurodivergent condition is likely to be covered by the Equality Act. The answer varies slightly according to whether it is a formal diagnosis or a self-diagnosis. So formal diagnoses do hold more weight and more strength behind them because there's generally a series of clinical expertise and an assessment that has happened in order to come to that conclusion. A self-diagnosis obviously is generally more observational in terms of somebody's own behaviours and arguably perhaps their own motivations in certain circumstances as well. Why is it likely to be covered? Well, there are two things that you need to consider with a disability under the Equality Act. One of them is the impact on somebody's day-to-day functioning, and the other is the longevity of it. And both of those things, the consideration needs to be made before any sort of treatment, masking, adaptations, medication, or anything like that. So in other words, if somebody is absolutely fine because they are having treatment of some sort, that doesn't that isn't the criteria on which you would assess it. You would assess them on what their functioning would be if they were not undergoing that treatment. So they weren't taking that medication, or they weren't having that therapy, or or they weren't able to mask their symptoms, for example. So if you think of any neurodivergent condition, firstly, is it long term? Well, yes, they're all lifelong. It's not like it's a curable thing. Um, Secondly, does it impact their day-to-day functioning? Well, by definition, probably yes. Um, they might well be able to cope with it, and they might well have strategies to deal with their condition, but ultimately, they all affect people's day-to-day functioning, whether it's somebody's ability to read, somebody's ability to process information, verbally or written, whether it's somebody's ability to interpret social circumstances, whether it's somebody's ability to concentrate on tasks, whatever it could be, it will generally affect people's day-to-day functioning. So it would be extremely rare that somebody, and actually I'm not aware of a situation, but it will be extremely rare where somebody's received a formal neurodiversity diagnosis and they're not covered by the Equality Act. It's less rare, it's more common that somebody might self-diagnose and not be covered by the Equality Act, because a self-diagnosis obviously doesn't necessarily mean, you know, accuracy, for example. So this is what I was covering a second ago. These are some of the criteria we would look at. Well, is the condition lifelong? Yes. Um, does it have an adverse effect on day-to-day functioning? So some of the elements that we would be considering when we're looking at functional ability are things like concentration or focus, memory, the ability to plan, social communication, that's both verbal and non-verbal cues, sensory processing, so that could be things like loud noises or flashing lights or busy environments, emotional regulation, this is the regulation of our ability to control our own emotions, or the ability to deal with emotional situations, and executive function. So this is linked to concentration and focus, but this is about the ability to start and stop tasks, and understand and begin working on tasks quickly, or whether somebody takes sort of a bit of a little while to understand the purpose of a task and then work around that. It's quite difficult to explain its executive function, but it's quite heavily linked to autism and autistic spectrum disorder, and to a lesser extent also ADHD. So these are some of the things that we would be considering when we're looking at somebody's day-to-day functioning. So obviously the main legislation is the Equality Act. There are other laws that you would need to consider in your roles as well in HR. Examples of these are the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations as well. Generally, these are legislations that require you to ensure that the workplace is a safe environment. Now, traditionally in that context, we're thinking about trailing wires and exposed electrical plug sockets and pat testing of electrical equipment and things. But it goes beyond that, and also we're looking at psychological safety and cognitive safety as well. So that can also include external stimuli like lights and noises and ventilation and cleanliness, and people's DSE setups and so on. There's also another couple of regulations here as well, which are also relevant. You're probably more familiar with them than we are in your particular job roles, but they all relate to your kind of obligations to employees who are neurodivergent, and to ensure that they're kind of offered a safe working environment and a healthy working environment. So that's a bit of a basic background on the law. We are going to come back to that in just a second. It's also very important to kind of reflect on the fact that underperformance these days can be explained a lot better via neurodiversity. So it's an important topic just to touch on for a second, because we're seeing anecdotally, and I'm sure I could get the stats on this if I needed to, we're seeing an enormously increased volume of referrals to our occupational health service for employees who have got some sort of formal action going on, and then they've explained their behaviour via their neurodiversity. Examples of this that we've seen just this week include underperformance, so not hitting targets. They include unacceptable behaviours, in my last webinar, I cited an example of a teacher who was making explicit and illicit comments to their teenage female students. I won't go into detail on that because it's not a particularly pleasant case, but they explain that via their neurodiversity. Now, these are all situations where neurodiversity may explain their behavior, it may explain their variable output or their underperformance. Doesn't necessarily mean that as an employer it justifies it. As an employer, you're not making a legal decision as to whether your organization can tolerate somebody's performance or behavior. You're more looking at a professional decision. So whether it's explained via a health condition or whether it's explained via neurodiversity or a cognitive condition or psychological condition, if a behavior is unacceptable to you, then it remains unacceptable to you. And clearly a teacher making inappropriate comments or somebody only hitting their 10% of their targets or somebody being aggressive towards clients or something to that effect, doesn't really matter how it's explained. They are probably behaviors that I would assume are not things that you can tolerate. So you would still continue to manage the underperformance as you would do normally. It's just, you'd need to be a touch more careful and probably a touch more understanding and perhaps look at supportive measures first before you went down any form of, disciplinary or performance management type route, for example. Obviously, I'm not just talking about performance management here. We could be talking about, grievances or gross misconduct or anything like that too. That said, and we've only really focused on negative elements so far, neurodiversity also can come with some strengths. This is something that the increase in prevalence and understanding of neurodiversity has actually had massively beneficial effects on, because organisations have really begun to understand some of the strengths that neurodiversity can bring with it as well. This can include things like being particularly good at problem solving, for example, or being particularly creative. Or being particularly good at pattern recognition, or being particularly observant, or being having particularly good attention to detail on matters, or perhaps understanding, having numerical strengths, for example. Clearly it's clear to see that perhaps in an accounting role or even maybe an IT development role or something like that, pattern recognition and numerical processing is particularly useful skills to have. So it can be very easy to slip into the habit of kind of only considering the weaknesses that come with neurodiversity or the challenges, but there are strengths as well. And interestingly, there's actually tribunal evidence to back this up, which we're going to cover in a second too. But it's one of the reasons that focusing on support and adjustments are particularly beneficial for employers of neurodivergent employees, because it's not ultimately health conditions usually only have a negative impact. It's rare that someone would have a health condition that would actually have the ability to improve their output at work. Not so with neurodiversity. Neurodiversity can improve people's output at work. It can make them particularly good at things. So that's sort of where neurodiversity differs from a management point of view to other health conditions. So it can be seen, it's two sides of the same coin, but it can certainly be seen as being a positive as well. And that's where things like management training can be so effective. So if you're a manager, if you're an organization employing a number of neurodivergent employees, then management training is particularly effective. So let's look at a few recent tribunals. I think we're going to cover 3 or 4 here. I forget which. But I've also referenced a few others as well. There's been, as we talked about earlier, a significantly increased number of tribunals relating to neurodiversity recently. This year alone has been extremely busy in the courts with neurodiversity tribunal rulings, some of which have also gone so far as EATs as well, which is particularly useful. We're going to talk about one of those in a second. So this first one, James versus the Venture. So Mr. James was a play worker for a children's centre, so he was sort of engaging in play therapy, those sorts of things. He had a formal diagnosis for autistic spectrum disorder and anxiety, and requested adjustments for sensory sensitivities. play centres are quite overstimulating environments, lots of bright colours, lots of noise, lots of sort of lights and flashing lights and that sort of thing. Some adjustments were agreed, but they weren't consistently applied. It's quite a common issue where employers will make adjustments for a while and then sort of forget about them and then carry on as they were. That's what happened here. It's a bit of a side note and probably not what we're talking about today, but an important fact of the tribunal, if you wanted to go and read about it, is there were some other discriminatory issues that happened as well. The CEO, for example, described the individual as being a weirdo. That's in inverted commas, that's a direct quote. And he also compared neurodiversity to being a little bit like being hungover in terms of someone's ability to concentrate, which doesn't take a genius to work out. That's fairly insulting to somebody who's, you know, got a condition as opposed to been out on the lash the night before. It was found that his conditions were indeed covered by the Equality Act, and the adjustments were not applied consistently enough for the individual to have made reasonable adjustments. In this particular instance, Mr. James was awarded £17,000 in damages. Approximately £15,000 of that was the award, and then the other 2,000 were kind of covering administrative costs. Another case, a sort of similar case here was Mr. Sanders versus Peloton Interactive. Now, this is Peloton as in, the bicycle people, those kind of home bikes that we cycle on and everyone shouts, "Go Peloton," and all that kind of thing. They have a pretty funky office. It's an office that sort of reflects their brand and their values and their culture and what they want. So their office is an extremely loud environment. It's quite dark. They pump odors into it, sort of, what's the word? Diffusers and scents and things through the office. And it's quite an overstimulating environment. Now, Mr. Saunders had autism at the time, and he was also later diagnosed with ADHD and depression. He requested adjustments to his role. It was a client-facing role. He was sort of a client experience manager, which ultimately meant he was sort of walking people through the office and having meetings and leading them to their bikes and doing product displays and stuff. And he requested adjustments, and they were either not implemented or they weren't consistently implemented. Now, this was quite an interesting one because the tribunal found that whilst there was no expectation that Peloton would change their offices, for example, because it reflected an important element of their brand, there were adjustments that they reasonably could have made. That would have included giving him Mr. Saunders regular breaks. It would have included allowing him to go and sit in a quieter area at times. It would have included giving him noise-cancelling headphones to block out external stimuli, and it would have included less exposure to sort of flashing lights and bright lights and stuff. So again, the tribunal was upheld. The compensation amount has not yet been agreed, but the tribunal was upheld. Similar situation to the last tribunal that we just discussed. Now, this one is a more interesting one. Well, I don't know if it's more interesting, but this one was a fairly significant one. This is Stedman versus Haven Leisure. So Mr. Stedman he was an applicant for a position. So he was never actually employed, but he was an applicant for a position, and he had autistic spectrum disorder and ADHD. He was rejected for the role and claimed disability discrimination as a result. Now, that's sort of a little bit by the by here. The relevant element to this tribunal is the original tribunal found that he was not covered by the Equality Act because it balanced his strengths against his difficulties. We talked earlier about the strengths of someone who's neurodivergent and the challenges. This was the wrong approach taken by the Employment Tribunal, and the decision was escalated to the Employment Appeals Tribunal, who actually overturned this and found that the law had been wrongly applied. The use of coping strategies and the focus on the strengths of someone who's neurodivergent are, frankly, completely irrelevant. They don't remove the underlying adverse effect, and they don't negate somebody's coverage under the Equality Act. Now, this is a bit technical, but quite a significant tribunal and quite a significant legal case for us, because it means that somebody's ability to mask their symptoms or manage their symptoms, or even apply their neurodiversity in positive ways, doesn't negate any challenges that they also suffer as a result. So it's not a bank account that you're depositing. It's not like saying if I put £5 in and take £5 out, then we can call it quits. Just because they've put their £5 in other words, they've got strengths, doesn't mean that the £5 they're taking out in terms of their challenges aren't also valid. So this is important. This is very important for employers, and this will get referenced quite a lot in years to come. There are three others that we're not going to discuss today based on time, but these are ones that are worth looking at. Curran versus Capgemini, Kayla versus Insights, which is the case of ASPE. If you've seen any of my previous webinars, I've discussed the case of ASPE there. I'm not being derogatory here, but in a way, this was an individual who referred to themselves as being called ASPE in reference to Asperger's syndrome. And Elliott versus Dorset County Council, that was another relevant one. That one's a little bit older than the others that we've talked about, but those are also three that are worth Googling and having a little look. ChatGPT is very good for that, by the way. If you type in these things into ChatGPT and say, give me a summary of these cases, they will summarize them quite nicely for you. So some key learnings for employers. We've got a couple of minutes left. Some key learnings for employers. Firstly, neurodivergent conditions are likely to be covered by the Equality Act. We can't definitively say they are, but they probably are. So you as an employer need to consider that and need to implement reasonable adjustments. That it's also becoming considerably more common. So the need to implement reasonable adjustments is considerably more common. With that comes a challenge for you as an employer because you can't really provide all adjustments to all people. So you're best guided by independent occupational health services to ensure that any adjustments are required, they're needed, you're not doing more than you need to do, and also ensure that any adjustments are implemented fairly and reasonably without you kind of overstepping the mark in terms of what you need to do. In other words, it helps to make sure you're doing what you need to do, but you're not doing what you don't need to do, because that would be a waste of your time too. Interestingly, there was another case, we didn't actually discuss this particular tribunal, but formal awareness alone isn't enough. I've not really worded that particularly well, but formal awareness means that you're formally aware of somebody's neurodiversity. There is also constructive awareness too. That was one of the cases that we didn't discuss today, but if there is the suggestion that an employer should have known about somebody's neurodiversity, then a defense of saying, well, they never told me, unfortunately doesn't cut the mustard. So if there is a suggestion that somebody is neurodiverse and you're not sure, that is enough for you to need to do something about it. I appreciate that might not be good news to you, but them's the rules. However, all of those things said, neurodiversity doesn't necessarily form a comprehensive defence for any sort of underperformance or misconduct issue, and there are many instances of tribunal rulings where individuals are covered by the Equality Act, but that doesn't justify their behaviour to an extent where the employer should tolerate that behaviour, and therefore dismissals for performance or capability or gross misconduct have continued to be justified. It's just that the employer has to make sure that they are doing what they can to negate an employee's challenges first. And that's it. They are kind of the key takeaways from this session. I hope you found that useful. Apologies, on this occasion today, we're not going to have time for any sort of Q&A. Given there's only a few of you on today's call, there probably isn't any need anyway. But if you did have any questions that you wanted to ask or you wanted to run through with me, please by all means do get in touch with me. Let me know, email me, use the Ninjas forum, whatever works for you. And I'll be happy to kind of answer them or point you in the direction of some relevant guidance or perhaps even some relevant tribunals that might help to answer the question. That's it for now, though. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure, and best of luck with your upcoming neurodiversity cases. All the best.